Greetings, everyone. My name is Don Lavin, and I'm Executive Director of the ARC Minnesota. I just wanted to say, many of you don't know me, but I have had a 40-year career working in the area of employment and disability. And I just wanted to say that on September 29th, 2014 was one of the proudest days of my career when Minnesota passed and approved the Employment First policy. It was a day when Minnesota said, we will not marginalize people because of a disability if they choose to work. If you want to work, we're going to find the means, we're going to find the way to make that happen for you, because work is possible and work is a choice. I don't want to bore you with a lot of statistical data, but I thought it would be helpful to share just a couple of things with you to give you some national as well as state context. I'm kind of a research nerd, and I like to get on the line and look at how we're doing nationally as well as how we're doing in Minnesota. And we tend to think in Minnesota that we're ahead of everyone else. And don't get me wrong, we are, we're excellent at delivering disability services in our state, but we're not quite as good as we think we are. But first, a little bit about some national data. I was on the Department of Labor's website, and I go on there periodically to take a look at the employment participation rate of Americans with disabilities. And I don't know if you know what that looks like, but 19.8%, so less than 2 out of 10 Americans with disabilities are currently in the competitive labor force. And that compares to 68.8% for all Americans. By the way, this data is from May of 2015, so it's very fresh. I work, as I mentioned, for the ARC Minnesota, and we're part of a tri-level organization. We have a national office, the state, and we have regional chapters. Our national office in 2011 conducted a national study with families of individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And they produced a report that's called the FINDS Study. And what they found in doing this research with families is that 85% of families responding said that their adult child, working age child, was not in the labor force. So only 15% of adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities nationally were in the labor force. Again, we tend to think that we're a little bit ahead of the curve in Minnesota, but here's a study I wanted to share with you out of the University of Massachusetts Institute on Community Inclusion. They produced a national report on employment and outcomes and studied every single state in the union. And what they found is that in Minnesota, 83% of the individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities receiving waivered services were being supported in center-based work programs. 83%. That ranked number 1 in the country. Number 1. I don't think it's a distinction I'm particularly proud of. And then just one more study. The National Core Indicator study revealed that 31% of Minnesotans with disabilities were in some sort of a paid job in the workforce. Only 26%, 1 in 4, were working in individual competitive employment positions. But here's what I wanted you to hear. Of those that were not working, almost 60% said they would prefer to have a job. And here's the next one that's a little bit troublesome. For the people who don't have a job, less than half, it was only 40%, had a job goal in their individual service plan. So when we hear that people should have a choice, I think we all agree, we live in America, people should have a choice, but I don't think that choice is being honored. I don't think that choice is being respected. And that's why the Employment First policy has an informed choice provision, because we believe it's going to be more than just checking a box and asking somebody whether or not they'd like to work. We need to supply families and people with disabilities with good information and we hope experiences, which will give them a basis for making a decision about whether or not work makes sense for them. Okay, I'm going to move right into my presentation. I was asked to speak about employment and disability and speak a little bit about some of the misconceptions around this particular topic. So I want to jump right in. Do any of these look familiar to you? I often hear when we ask people about why they're not working, we hear about no accessible transportation, that people work too slow, that people are too vulnerable to work, they're not going to be accepted by coworkers, they're going to lose disability benefits, they don't have the necessary and essential job skills, they're going to lose health care, they don't have access to employment funding. Well, as my slide says here, sometimes the common wisdom is not always grounded in real facts. Now, I want you to understand that some of what I have up here, there are partial truths, half-truths, and I'm not saying that supporting people to go to work is not complex. It is. It is indeed. I actually know a lot of people who have overcome particular issues on this page. And we're going to be speaking with a panel in a little while, and I'm going to be asking them about how they addressed some of these barriers in their pathway and journey to go to work. So I want to spend a little bit of time sharing some of the research with you because I would like to challenge some of the facts that we often hear about that are blocking people from their journey into the workforce. Before I do this, I want to ask you sort of rhetorically, where do you stand? Where do you stand on this issue of people with disabilities going to work in the workforce in the way that it was defined by my good friend Andrea? Maybe a better question is, what direction are you headed with respect to this topic? Okay, I'm going to see if I can make this work, but I wanted to show you that you can change a direction by thinking about it. You don't believe me? Okay. I'm going to show you a moving train, and I'm going to ask all of you to think about changing the direction that the train is going. Okay? Let's see how well you do. All right, change the direction of the train. Were you able to do it? Were most of you able to do it? Yeah. Okay. The point in my showing you this is that you can make changes, but it starts with intent. It starts with willful intent. You can think about something, and obviously, supporting people to go to work is going to take more than good wishes. It's going to take expertise. It's going to take access to partnerships and resources, a willing employer. But we can make employment happen for anyone. But we have to take those first steps, and we got to take those first steps in the right direction. And I don't know where you are today, but if you're looking at other options, I hope you'll consider changing direction. All right, I'm going to start with the question first is, Employment First champions want to close down shelter workshops and center-based services. So how many think it's true? The answer is false. I am a founding member of the Employment First Coalition in Minnesota. I also had the good opportunity to sit down with some colleagues to help craft the Employment First policy. I can tell you straight up that this was always about increasing the employment of people with disabilities. There was certainly never any mention about closing down workshops, center-based kinds of services. Really, what we are concerned about and what we are interested in is looking at practices, policies and practices that support people in going to work. Employment First means employment only. What do you think? True or false? False. It's false. The people crafting the Employment First policy certainly understand that folks with disabilities need all kinds of services to live, work, and recreate in the community. But what I did want to say to you is that we believe that employment is a gateway to many things that people want in terms of a self-determined life, whether it's living in the community, having discretionary money for recreation. People have a very broad interest in living in the community, and we know that employment is a gateway to making that happen for many, as it is for many of us in the room who have a job. Employment First ensures people with disabilities have information and opportunities to make an informed choice about working in the labor force at competitive wages and benefits. True or false? It's true. As I was sharing earlier, the provisions of informed choice in the policy are really requiring that we provide good information for people and experiences. We're very interested in particular in young people leaving secondary education and making sure that as they take those first steps into adulthood, that they have the opportunities to have paid work experiences while they're still in school. Why? Because a paid work experience, if you have a paid work experience, you have a 5 times better chance of having a competitive job once you leave secondary education. So we want to make sure that families and people with disabilities have the best information possible so that they can make an informed choice. Most job seekers with significant disabilities need sheltered workshop or center-based services to prepare for integrated competitive employment. True or false? It is false. There's research that shows that the best way for people with disabilities to go to work in the competitive labor force is going the direct route, looking at direct job placement and employment supports that will look at an individual uniquely, and we're talking about one person, one job, looking at the interests and talents and then working with the individual to find the right employer, unless they're looking at self-employment as an option. People with significant disabilities need center-based work services because they don't work fast enough. I've heard this a lot. What do you think? It's false. Not all jobs require productivity in terms of quantity. We certainly have jobs where quality is important. So I think we have to certainly be very careful that sometimes we hear that people that are served in center-based services are working at certain levels of productivity. Well, sure, that productivity is being measured on a very finite number of jobs. Certainly, if we want folks to go to work, we need to be thinking about the entire workforce, the entire realm of possibility, where people can not only exercise their interests, but we can tap their talents and tap their skills in ways that make sense for them. So we wanted to be sure to cover with you that work speed in terms of general productivity types of things, the hand assembly, these kinds of things, these are not the only kinds of jobs that people with disabilities can do. We want to have people follow their dreams, and that's going to take us in many different directions into the workforce. People with disabilities will not be accepted by their coworkers. I hear this a lot. What do you think? It's false. America's Strength Foundation conducted a study a few years back. They did a national survey with all Americans. What they found is that 91% of Americans rated the productivity and the work of people with disabilities as equal to or better than other workers. And here's the curious finding. 87% of the people surveyed said they would rather give their business to companies that hire people with disabilities than those who do not. So we certainly are seeing a sea change in terms of acceptance in the workforce by employers. Working in the community labor force is less safe than participating in center-based services. True or false? Well, let me put it this way to you. I've never read a study that said that working in center-based services was safer. I called the Ombudsman's office in Minnesota and asked this question. And the majority of the complaints that come to their attention come from facility and center-based kinds of programs. They don't have a great deal of data on people in community settings. But I want to make a point about this. When I was running employment programs, we would never support the concept of placing somebody in a job where we didn't believe they were safe and where the ideal conditions of employment for that individual were present. So we take the issue of vulnerable adults very seriously, but we certainly can choose businesses that make a lot of sense for people. People with disabilities cannot work in competitive employment because they don't have the job qualifications to succeed. It's false. Now, let me explain my concept here. We're not talking just about traditional job descriptions when we're talking about employment of folks with disabilities these days. So I'll make a distinction between qualified workers and quality workers. We have many, many different ways to support people in going to work today, and we can customize employment around the interests and abilities of people instead of working to make people with disabilities fit posted and vacated job descriptions. This is a very exciting area that's emerging. We have new practices in assessment and planning called discovery. And the purpose of discovery is really to understand who people are. What are their interests? What are their innate skills and talents? And how can we support them and build jobs around who they are? People who choose work will lose their disability and health care benefits. We have people in the back who will probably agree with me that work is an asset. I was told by the Disability 101 people that 90% of the people that they work with are better off with a paid job. 90%. Healthcare benefits. Minnesota is a Medicaid buy-in state. There are sliding fee scales for people to access the health care that they need. So people in Minnesota are very fortunate. A parent guardian's expectations and influence about working in the workforce are key drivers to achieving integrated employment outcomes. What do you think? True or false? That's why we're holding tonight's event. It's also a reason why I am at the ARC Minnesota. I wanted to bring this message about the possibility of work to more families. Let me share this. I was just watching a video this last week. It was put on by the Kessler Foundation regarding a new research study that they conducted with people with disabilities, and they asked them about the barriers in going to work. In the top 5 were families. Now, this is not me. This is people with disabilities saying, it's my family that doesn't think that going to work is a good idea. This is one of the reasons why we want to get out in Minnesota and talk with family members, because we believe more people can work and could work if they have the blessings of their family and the support of their family to do so. People who leave center-based programs will lose their friends. True or false? It's false. There's many ways to manage transition, whether it's coming out of a high school or whether it's in a center-based work situation. People can see friends on weekends if they're leaving friends behind. But I also want to let you know, when people go out into the labor force, they meet new friends. They meet friends who don't have disabilities. It enriches and broadens and provides for a more rewarding life. People working competitive employment make more money than their peers. True or false? Research tells us that people who work in the community make twice as much money as those in center-based situations. I just looked at the most recent annual report from DEED, the Department of Employment and Economic Development in Minnesota, with respect to the extended employment program. The average wage of somebody in supported employment, individual in supported employment, was over $10 an hour. For individuals served in center-based services, and the numbers, by the way, were relatively equal in number, it was about $4.05 an hour. It costs more money to support people in the community labor force. True or false? It's false. The research tells us that it costs 74% more to support people in center-based types of services when competitive employment is a goal, as opposed to going the direct route. So I don't know whether some of the things I've been sharing here are resonating with you, but I just thought I would try to set some of the record straight with some of the facts. Finally, the decision about whether or not to work and where is an individual's right and choice. Of course. Of course. Nobody here is telling anyone what to do. We're simply saying it's possible, and we're trying to encourage people to consider a working life. I like to tell people you have a choice about whether or not you want to work. But you don't necessarily get to choose the consequences of that decision. And really what I'm saying is that when people move into center-based services, they're going to earn less money over their lifetime. Many who go into those programs will never leave. This is pretty much documented. And finally, the informed choice provisions require that we revisit this particular decision about whether or not people choose work. So it isn't a one-time, I don't want to work, and then you got a lifetime of moving in another direction. This provision says, let's revisit this question. People do change their mind, people grow in many different ways. Maybe work is going to be a better choice for them down the road. So why should working age youth and adults with disabilities choose work? Because they can. Because they can. And the research is very compelling about that.